This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, I'm here, as the title suggests, to talk off the stories of films. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes stuff, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. I've got a couple of corkers for you this episode as well. The films that I tend to pick, well, they have a mainstream leaning, really. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Not really interested in snark, not really interested in punching down. I just think it's worth celebrating just how difficult it is to make a movie, particularly a good one. This episode is coming out in December 2020, so I'm moving into my festive collection of films that I'm going to cover in the podcast just over the next couple of episodes. And I'm starting, well, every time I put out on my Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew, that was a quick plug, well done me, or on social media as to which film would you like me to cover in the podcast. This is the film that has come up more than any other. I'm going to take you back to 1988, but not before I've played you a clip. I'll tell you the story the other side of this.
I wanted this to be professional, efficient, adult, cooperative, not a lot to ask. Alas, your Mr. Takagi did not see it that way, so he won't be joining us for the rest of his life. We can go anywhere you want us. You can walk out of here or be carried out. But have no illusions. We are in charge. So, decide now, each of you. And please remember, we have left nothing to chance. Get them back! Not back! Now I have a machine gun. Ho, ho, ho.
Right then, let's do it. That's the glorious, late and much missed Alan Rickman, of course, in 1988's Die Hard, directed by John McClane. Screenplay credited to Jeb Stewart and Stephen E. D'Souza, based on a novel by Roderick Thorpe. Coming to that. The cast for this one is, it's a terrific ensemble, isn't it? Never mind just Bruce Willis headlining as John McClane, but Bonnie Bedelia, Reginald VelJohnson, Paul Gleason, Deborah White, William Atherton, Hart Bochner, Alan Rickman. You find me a weak link in the midst of this cast, and I'd genuinely be surprised. Now, in one of those moments of just self-defeating myself, really, I want to acknowledge up front, there is a brilliant book published by Titan called Die Hard, The Ultimate Visual History, written by James Mottram and David S. Cohen, that tells the story better than I'm about to. I've lent on it a little bit for this podcast, but I do really recommend seeking that out. As always with the podcast, what I try and do is provide you an entry point so you can go off and explore an awful lot more about the film in question. So let's go to Jeb Stewart then, as a screenwriter in 1987, in the early part of his career. He was up and coming. He got a deal to get a screenplay made into a film that was pulled pretty late in the day, and he was on the hunt for work. Now, meanwhile, producer Larry Gordon did have a production deal. He had that deal set up at 20th Century Fox. His head of development was someone called Lloyd Levin. And one of the projects that Levin was working on was an adaptation of a book by Roderick Thorpe called Nothing Lasts Forever. Now, Nothing Lasts Forever was actually a sequel that Roderick Thorpe had written. The Detective, first of all, in the 1960s. Nothing Lasts Forever came along the following decade. And in the case of the Detective, that had actually been turned into a movie starring Frank Sinatra. Now, Thorpe was inspired to write the novel about German terrorists taking over a Los Angeles office block, which is the basis of Nothing Lasts Forever, after watching the film The Towering Inferno. And the book told of a cop in his 60s. His wife's been unfaithful, so he's divorced her. And there are key differentials from the film that we ultimately got, although there's also a fair amount of overlap. But the book ended up in the hand of Jeb Stewart. That the Gordon Company gave him the job of adapting it, and he was really having problems getting into it. And it was only after he'd had a bit of a barney with his wife that he found a way in. That he was working really long hours trying to get his break as a screenwriter. He had a row when he's at home, and he drove off angry, knowing he should have apologised but didn't apologise. And he realised that he hadn't said sorry as he pulled over his car to stop and think about it all. And this is ultimately where the genesis of John McClane came from. The idea of someone stubborn enough to go from New York all the way to Los Angeles to apologise and then not apologise. So he'd found his central character, who was instantly quite different from the lead character in Nothing Lasts Forever. He called him John Ford in the early drafts of the script. That idea was nixed for fairly obvious reasons for classic movie fans, and thus the name McClane was substituted in instead. But Stewart didn't have experience writing action movies, so he wrote this as a thriller. He got put together his screenplay, and then he was being called into 20th Century Fox to basically pitch the movie. And so he was called into the Fox building, and he was 15 minutes, as he described in the aforementioned book, into the pitch. It wasn't going well, and then Larry Gordon just said, go and write it. You seem to know what you're doing. And it was one of those moments that's not supposed to happen to a writer, but did. A terrible pitch, and he got the job. As such, Jeb Stewart went away, and he knew he had to turn around the first draft of this script quickly. In fact, draft 0 of what would become Die Hard would be done in under 6 weeks in the end. Now, one of the consequences of his haste was that the research he was doing for the film was going to need to be local, and he was in the Los Angeles area, and he needed a high-rise building to basically set the mechanics of the screenplay around. That was, again, the source novel had ingredients that he could play with. He needed something mapped out in his head, and it was circumstance, really, that the meeting he'd had been taking place at 20th Century Fox, and 20th Century Fox new headquarters was being built at the time next door. So Stewart managed to bag his way inside the part completed building, and he took the tour of the office building that was ultimately going to be called Fox Plaza, and it allowed him to geographically map out how he was going to do the film. He also made a decision, as he was putting his draft together, to beef up the supporting characters in the film, that this wouldn't be a one-person crusade, as it were. He wanted a full ensemble, and thus he got to work, delivered his script in June of 1987, and incredibly, this is about a year before the film was released. The production of this was so contracted, as we're about to find out. He delivered his script, crossed his fingers. Now, this was on a Friday that he handed the script in. He'd had bad experiences with Hollywood before, and so he decided to go away for the weekend. This in an era where we didn't have mobile phones, text messages, WhatsApp, all that gubbins. And so he went away with no way of anyone getting in touch. And what he didn't know was his timing was absolutely on point. That at the stage the script for Nothing Lasts Forever went in, 20th Century Fox did not have a big movie for the summer of 1988, and it didn't have a lot of time to find one. His script had turned up in the right place at the right time, and the movie was effectively greenlit within 24 hours, as Stewart would find out when he got home from his weekend away. Now, elsewhere at 20th Century Fox, the film Predator, remember that? That was going to be one of its big movies for the summer of 1987, so it was readying release of that. Now, that was directed by John McTiernan, produced by Joel Silver, also produced by Larry Gordon as well. And it was Gordon who gave Joel Silver a call. Now, Silver was pretty much an uber producer at the time. The Lethal Weapon films were his. He was known for being quite a character. I think that's fairly safe to say. And he read the script to Die Hard and liked it and had a conversation with Jeb Stewart and told Stewart that basically he was going to fire him at some point anyway, just because that's the way the whole process works. Really likes the script, but you're going to get fired because I need to get the script finished and this is part of the process. Now, to be fair, Larry Gordon he'd protect Jeb Stewart throughout the rewriting process. One thing that Silver did that instantly changed the film was he changed the title of it. That he changed its name to Die Hard. Now, Die Hard was originally going to be the name of a film written by Shane Black called The Last Boy Scout, but Silver liked it for this one, asked permission of Shane Black, and all of a sudden that was the name of the movie. I will be coming to The Last Boy Scout in a future podcast. Now, with Silver came writer Stephen E. D'Souza, who'd penned the likes of Commando and 48 Hours. And Silver also brought with him something called his whammo theory. And this is the idea that every 10, 12 minutes in a film, there's a big action sequence or a big explosion or something like that. And so this was pretty much his way of working at the time. He also went hunting for a director. And the first port of call was, a Helmer had a hit with a film called, you might have heard of this one, RoboCop. Yeah, Paul Verhoeven was approached to direct Die Hard, but he took a look at the script and said no. Silver then was trying to persuade John McTiernan to take it on. Now, McTiernan had just finished working on Predator and was pretty knackered as a consequence of that. But whilst McTiernan was saying no, Silver kept sending him the script, and then McTiernan said no, and Silver sent the script. And the thing is that the idea of terrorists didn't really appeal to McTiernan, but nonetheless Silver's persistence did work in the end. And so what McTiernan reasoned in the end was John McClane needed to be a working class hero. And so there's a sequence fairly early in the movie where a limo is sent to the airport to pick up John McClane, and McTiernan reasoned, he should sit in the front of the limo with the driver. There was also the suggestion that instead of terrorists, that they're actually thieves, that they're pretending to be terrorists, but actually their objectives, not going too spoiler heavy, are a little more down to earth. What the reasoning there was, it would take away, quote, the right wing hate quality that otherwise you get were the villains of Die Hard just standard movie terrorists. Now, Silver wasn't necessarily oversold on all of these changes, but he wanted his director, and so he said yes. A new draft was put together that made some of the changes. That was completed by October 1987. Dialogue was pulled out and thinned out a little bit just to make it a bit pacier as well. There was also the fact that it needed to be turned a bit more into an action movie, and that's where Stephen E. D'Souza had real expertise. So they took the elements that Stewart wanted a thriller. John McTiernan wanted something a bit lighter, actually, and Silver wanted an action movie that D'Souza could deliver. And as a consequence, it was those three competing camps that resulted in the final screenplay for the movie. However, they were having to get a crack on that by the autumn of 1987, the film was deep in preparation, and they only had five weeks really to get the film ready for physical filming. And they had to find a location that was going to double, Nakatomi Plaza, the key location in the movie. The location scouts were having trouble finding such a building as well. So they looked at the idea of using just entirely studio sets to replicate it. They also scouted out possible locations in the city of Houston, but McTiernan reasoned they actually need something in Los Angeles near to the physical Fox studio to where the film was going to be cut. That time just wasn't on their side to take a whole film crew over to Houston from LA and then back again. And in the end, it was Jeb Stewart who pointed out that he'd done the research based on the office building that Fox owned. So why don't they use that building? Now, the problem was the building had opened in 1987. It wasn't fully occupied, although it was part occupied. But also, even though Fox owned the building, it didn't run the building. That a third-party company had come in to deal with that side of things. And this was, a working office block. And all of a sudden, it was going to have gunfire, it was going to have explosions, it was going to have an action movie taking place on the unused floors of the building, whilst the regular occupants of it went about their daily lives. So the real estate company that was handling the building wasn't best pleased and really pushed back against this. But a deal was done, with Fox ultimately having to pull its weight and say, we own the building, this is going to happen. And it was lamented by the film crew that the manager of the building was never very happy during the production of the film, which is pretty understandable. Now, when it came to casting, there was also a contract clause that was coming up that needed negotiation. And that goes back to Roderick Thorpe's book, The Detective, and the film that was made of it. Because Frank Sinatra starred in that, but as part of the contract he had, if a sequel was made to it, he had to be offered first refusal on the film. And thus, Frank Sinatra was offered the lead role of John McClane in Die Hard because contractually, Fox had no other choice but to do that. Now, according to Stephen E. D'Souza, in an interview, Sinatra had to turn the role down, which he did, saying, quote, "I'm too old and too rich." Others who were courted to play McClane were Clint Eastwood. He apparently turned it down. Paul Newman was not looking for roles that saw him wandering around with a gun. There was a rumour that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to be approached. In fact, there was a rumour that the script of Die Hard was originally Commando 2, but both those rumours were denied in more recent times by Stephen E. D'Souza. Richard Gere was one person who was offered the film, but he said no. Joel Silver apparently tried several times to get Richard Gere to be John McClane. No dice. Al Pacino was in the mix as well. And also the star of a TV series by the name of Moonlighting. A huge hit TV series Moonlighting was in the 1980s, and its male lead was Bruce Willis. Now, Bruce Willis as a movie entity, not so successful. He co-starred in the film Blind Date, which had come out in 1987, which had done decent business. But that was pretty much it. I mean, he was a comic actor. That's what he was known as. And he wasn't a big screen star. Now we see actors seamlessly going between the big screen and the small screen. Not so in the 80s. Far, far rarer. There was also the fact that once Willis's name was on the radar, he had a commitment to shoot the new season of Moonlighting. And so he wouldn't be able to fit it into his schedule anyway, until the news came that his co-star in Moonlighting, Sybil Shepherd, was pregnant with twins, and as a result there would be a 6-week delay before filming would begin on the new season of the show. That gave Willis a 6-week window to make Die Hard. He was duly offered the role of John McClane, and an incredible move in the context of the time. This unknown movie actor really was offered a $5 million salary to take the lead role. To give you an idea of just what a big deal that was, an article in the New York Times came out pretty much straight afterwards saying, I quote it, "20th Century Fox has paid Bruce Willis $5 million to star in a movie. For Hollywood, the result is equivalent to an earthquake. The map of movie star salaries must now be redrawn." And this wasn't for a proven movie star. This wasn't going to, Burt Reynolds or someone who was putting bums on seats in the 80s. It wasn't going to a Clint Eastwood. It was going to someone without a huge box office hit to their name. As Alan Ladd Jr., who was then chairman of MGM, he was quoted in that New York Times article as saying, "This throws the business out of whack." And speaking, when he was asked specifically about the salary paid to Bruce Willis for Die Hard, Ladd said, "Like everyone else in town, I was stunned." Nonetheless, by September 1987, Bruce Willis was in. What wasn't sorted was the casting of the villain. Now, the character of Hans Gruber, the villain of the piece, had gone through several changes as the script was reworked. But in terms of who was going to play him, well, the name of Alan Rickman was actually first put forward by his agents to be a villain in the Arnold Schwarzenegger James Belushi movie Red Heat. But it was the same cast. It was Jackie Birch, the same casting director on both films. And whilst it was felt that Rickman wasn't right for Red Heat, that would ultimately come out around the same time as Die Hard, he'd stuck in her head, unsurprisingly so. I mean, he'd come to America and appeared on stage in Broadway in 1987, winning a Tony Award. Joel Silver had also seen him in a play, and he got the call to go to Los Angeles and record an audition for the film. And within 48 hours, he was cast in the role of Hans Gruber. Now, he wasn't massively keen to do it. That he didn't really want to do an action movie. He was interested in getting involved in Hollywood. And I mean, it's been announced just before this podcast is recorded that Alan Rickman's diaries will be published in 2022. So it might be worth me revisiting this in a couple of years' time when we'll have more of a perspective on Rickman's angle of it all. But it was his agents in October 1987 persuaded him to sign on to the film. I did have the chance to talk to the wonderful man before we sadly lost him. And he was tongue-in-cheek about the fact that he's known for he's only played 2 villains in his eyes. I'd say 3 if you count the film Quigley Down Under, and those are what he tended to be known for on the big screen. But then the work that he put in, I mean, crikey. So Jackie Birch then looked for the ensemble of quality actors to surround Willis in. That was felt to be important, hence the likes of Bonnie Bedelia, Reginald VelJohnson, Devereaux White. They were all hired. Hart Bochner came in to play the role of Ellis. I love Ellis in Die Hard. Joel Silver already knew him, and they really wanted a couple of slimy villainous characters in this, which is why also William Atherton, who'd appeared in Ghostbusters, of course, he also got the call and joined the cast of Die Hard. Now, filming would begin on the movie in November 1987 after those few weeks of preparation. There was a mix that some of the sets were being built on the 20th Century Fox lot, which was next door to Fox Plaza. The biggest set that was physically built was the atrium of Nakatomi, which cost about $1.5 million just to realise. There's never really been an agreed published budget for the film total, but it was believed to be in the 25 to 35 million mark, and that set was a fairly substantive part of the investment. There was a little bit of location work done, but again, the clock was ticking. So they did some stuff at Los Angeles Airport. They did the limo ride through LA, local convenience store just round the corner from the Fox lot, that was used. But primarily they used sound stages. They used a 30-foot backdrop of the LA skyline that was painted, and they used the Fox Plaza building. When it came to the production design, in fact, it's worth noting that the J.G. Ballard novel High Rise was an influence. That was filmed by Ben Wheatley just a few years ago. The director of photography on the movie, though, that was Jan de Bont, who would go on to direct films like Speed and Twister. And he and John McTiernan, I mean, they butted heads quite a lot on this, but they did agree they wanted this to feel a bit different from the action films of the 80s, that they wanted to make the building, the Nakatomi Plaza building, feel like a character in there. They wanted to shoot it, if anything, like a documentary. They following McClane around and really feeling his perspective in the film. They also went against the trend of the 1980s. I'm grateful for James Mottram's book for this, by deliberately including lots of lens flare, which wasn't the done thing and was pretty much frowned about. And also because of the haste of it all and getting all the sets in place, the production had to go from the building to the stages and the stages to the building while sets on one were being prepared and setups were being prepared. The whole thing had to keep moving. I mean, it was shooting primarily at night as well. They had this 6-week window for Bruce Willis. When they actually went into the Fox Plaza building to do some of the interior work there wasn't actually that much room on the floors either to accommodate a full film crew. And so part of the crew had to work on the floor above or below and just keeping it down to the skeleton people, the skeleton crew who would be needed for the scene in question, just on the floor where it was being shot. Now, McTiernan and Willis also, they didn't immediately gel either, so goes the story. And Willis wasn't really a fan of the blocking of the actors that McTiernan was doing. And ultimately it would take an intervention from Joel Silver, who apparently told Bruce Willis something along the lines of, if you you don't follow what McTiernan's telling you, your hair's going to look a bit odd in the film, and that reportedly did the trick. They still had to get all of Willis's stuff in the can first to release him in time for his moonlighting return, and this was a punishing schedule for him and exhausting to contract so much of an action film into such a short space of time, such a physically demanding role. That really put an awful lot of pressure on him, and he was feeling it with stories really about he was just getting flat out exhausted towards the end of the shoot. Alan Rickman, he was having a bit more fun. I mean, he'd asked at one point if he could do an American accent, and he demonstrated this to Stephen E. D'Souza, who rewrote the moment where the characters of John McClane and Hans Gruber meet for the first time. But again, spoiler alert, Gruber is pretending to be someone called Bill Clay. And it was little bits like that then changed various bits of the script, that they would come up with small moments that would have ramifications and ripples, that D'Souza would rewrite certain moments off the back of just that one suggestion. And as a consequence, this was a film already up against it that was just facing fairly late in the day script revisions. When Rickman did shoot that Bill Clay sequence as well, he'd actually injured his leg and was on crutches that day. There was fear that his injury was a lot worse than it turned out to be, but he also lived in fear that he was going to be replaced on the movie, and he had to be asked not to use his crutches in that scene when Joel Silver came along onto the set for that 1 minute, although I suspect Silver was on it for a lot, as it happens. Rickman did get to improvise quite a lot with Hart Bochner, though, the interactions between Gruber and Ellis. And I talked to Hart Bochner about this a few years ago, and he said we basically shot my part in sequence, which doesn't usually happen, and that really helped him get into the role, that he was able to freewheel a little bit with the character of Ellis, that he'd been brought on by Joel Silver, and John McTiernan again was not a fan. Hart Bochner told me McTiernan hated what I was doing. He loathed it. And he told me this story. And Bochner said the first day that I worked, we hadn't discussed it, I showed up and I had the beard. And my take on the character of Ellis was that I always feel when you're playing a bad guy, you look for their insecurity, which drives their behaviour. So he reasoned, while the character was a bad guy, he was certainly ridiculously obnoxious and a fly in everyone's ointment. And so he came at it from the behaviour of a cocaine addict. That's what Bochner realised. Now, he hadn't discussed this with McTiernan, but that's how he played the part. And so he said it's Christmas Eve, it's the party, he's all alone, he just wants someone, so he hits on Bruce Willis's wife, and I was doing it very much fast and loose and a bit hyper in the rehearsals. McTiernan came up to me and said, I don't know what you're doing, I hate it, it's not what I envisaged for this character, I want smooth, I want Cary Grant. And Bochner said to him, I know we've not discussed this, but I think Ellis's behaviour has got to come from insecurity and coke. And McTiernan said, you know what, that's BS, get rid of it, I hate it, and calm down. But Bochner persisted, and the first day of filming, that's how he played the role, and McTiernan wasn't happy. The second day of Bochner filming was the sequence where Willis and the company come in, and Ellis is swiping cocaine off the desk, and he was still playing it the same way, and McTiernan went for him, and he just said, what did I tell you yesterday? I hate it. But McTiernan then stopped and looked at producers Joel Silver and Larry Gordon, who were looking at the monitor and looking at the playback of the scene, and they were laughing. So McTiernan went over to see what they were laughing at, watched the footage, had a chat with them, went back to Bochner and says, you know what, you do whatever you want to do. And from that, the character of Ellis was born. And he said from that point onwards, Bochner would say, it was great, he let me go, we had a great time. And Bochner reasoned, it's interesting, sometimes the filmmaking process is best when you just let things evolve on their own level and in their own way. You just never know what you're going to end up with sometimes. And you know, it's interesting that Bochner's gone on to be a film director, making films like PCU and High School High, and that's in addition to his acting work as well. Now, one of the hardest stunts to get in the can was the roof sequence, because this was going to be physically shot on the top of the Fox Plaza building. Remember everything I've said about this was a working building? Now they were going to film a major motion picture stunt on the top of the sequence involving helicopters and all sorts of whatnot. It took months of work just to get that far, just to get the permits to get that far. And ultimately they had extras on the roof, they had helicopters flying in. There was a fear of the danger of it. McTiernan has admitted that in again an interview with James Mottram's book. But they did that whole sequence in one night. They also then, in terms of the more close-up helicopter moments, they did take those and shoot those elsewhere, some 30-40 miles north of Los Angeles, without Los Angeles just around, really, where they could have a little more scope just to do some movie stunt things. And in the end, there were 150 visual effects in the movie, that not computer effects either. It was all practically driven bits and bobs that they were using to get this film in the can. Now, filming on Die Hard wrapped in the end in January 1988, and I mean, it was on schedule as well, incredibly. Bruce Willis went off to do Moonlighting. Then there was the problem of how do you get this ready for July the 20th, and how do you get audience awareness ready for July the 20th as well. And so first and foremost, another editor had to be brought in. In the end, it was a team of two that were able to cut all the footage together to get the film right. But there was a feeling fairly early on that they had something here, that this was really working and this was really gelling. There were still problems. So the Motion Picture Association of America had to rate the movie, and it certainly had its say. It was originally going to put the film out with an X rating, which was commercial suicide. Fox couldn't have that, had to be cut back to an R. And as a consequence, an early sequence where Hans Gruber shoots Takagi, that was cut back, although it makes it more impactful, ironically. It did get the R rating. Michael Kamen's score for the film only came in late June, so weeks before the release of the film. But nonetheless, by this stage, the first test screening had gone through the roof. Now, promoting the film was going to be tricky as well, in that Bruce Willis was not a movie star. I keep coming back to this. Now you put Bruce Willis on a movie poster or a DVD cover in more recent times, and you get some instant name recognition. But as an action star, this was the era of Stallone. This was the era of Schwarzenegger. The films that were coming out around this time, well, there were going to be Rambo sequels. There's going to be Red Heat. There's going to be Crocodile Dundee 2. That was coming up as well. Huge sequel. And it's easy to understand just what a big deal Crocodile Dundee 2 was in the summer of 1988. And so Die Hard had to compete in that and break through somehow. Now, Newsweek's David Anson was pretty cutting about Willis and where he was placed in the promotion, saying in an article that Willis is the most unpopular actor to ever get $5 million for making a movie. And the research did point to the fact you've got to pull back on him a little bit, and that's why in the posters it's not Bruce Willis's face in close-up. There is that whole the Tower of Terror kind of feel to the poster of Die Hard. The film, nonetheless, was ready. It was and it was in cinemas in the summer of 1988. That it would debut in the US. Well, it would have a limited release on 21 screens for the weekend, July the 15th to the 17th, 1988. The reviews weren't stellar. It's worth noting that there was praise certainly for Alan Rickman's work. Pretty much mixed otherwise across the board. Although audiences quickly loved this one. Quickly loved it. The film came out then, and it had a modest opening, but then by its second week in release, when Fox expanded the theatre cut, the theatre count up to a more wide release, 1,276 screens. It shot up to number 3 at the US box office with $7 million on its second weekend. Now, to give some context of what it was up against, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was topping the charts. That had been around for 5 weeks at that point. Coming to America was 2. Clint Eastwood in the Deadpool was at 4. Midnight Run was at 5. Got to do that at some point, haven't I? The Bambi re-release was doing great guns. Big Top Pee-wee, Caddyshack 2, Big, Bull Durham. These were the films it was up against, and Die Hard was more than competing. It was a hit, and the $83 million that it grossed off the back of its budget was seen as a huge success. 83 million at this point, lots more money contextually than we'd think of it necessarily in box office reporting today, and it paved the way for fairly quick sequels as well. Die Hard 2 would follow a couple of years later. I've covered the other 3 Die Hard films, 2, 3 and 4 in previous podcasts. There was also a fan film that was released, A Good Day to Something or Other. I've not come to that yet, might do at some point. The other Another ramification was over time, Die Hard would become a particularly loved festive film, whether clickbait writers like that or not. It would also, of course, inspire umpteen websites to write articles every single year debating whether or not it's a Christmas film. The argument is just moot, really. It's just a great, great film. I'm watching it at Christmas. Suggest you do the same. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. If I can ask for your support, please. I'm an independent podcast producer. I sit in a room in the West Midlands just yapping into a microphone. All I have that's got me this far is your word of mouth. If you do like this podcast, please do leave a review at your podcast repository of choice, and ideally a positive review, please. That would be hugely appreciated. And if you could subscribe as well, that would just be wonderful. Likewise, if you want to support our print magazines, you can find them at store.filmstories.co.uk, where all sorts of Christmas gift subscription offers are on at the moment. And again, every magazine we sell is just like gold dust to us as an independent without a huge company behind us. But I want to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about, and I've deliberately picked a festive film that I think most of you won't have heard of or won't have seen, and I wanted to contrast that with Die Hard. I think this one is an absolute treat. I want to tell you the story of it, the other side of this clip.
We are not opening the doors.
My little girl's out there.
I'm getting my dad, all right?
How are we going to get past all the zombies?
I just had the best idea ever.
This is the stupidest idea ever.
All right, losers.
The streets are chaos and the outlook is dire.
What do I do? Make the movie! Destroy the brain!
We go through here, we might make it to the school before sundown. Plus, it'll be fun.
Yeah, certain death is so much fun.
This isn't fun anymore.
Now, to date, there isn't a huge tradition of Christmas-themed horror zombie musical comedies. Nonetheless, there is 2017's sublime Anna and the Apocalypse, directed by John McPhail, written by Ryan McHenry and Alan MacDonald, with a cast, a primarily young and at the time pretty unknown cast, featuring the likes of Ella Hunt, Malcolm Cumming, Sarah Swire, Christopher Levereau, Ben Wiggins, Mark Benton, Paul Kay and Sean Connor. Now, the story of this one, and it is a real treat if you've not seen it before, it started to some degree with Ryan Gosling refusing to eat breakfast cereal. That in 2013, a series of Google Vines, do you remember those kind of 6-second video clips, was put together by a young filmmaker by the name of Ryan McHenry, and his series, which was grouped together under the name Ryan Gosling Won't Eat His Cereal, featured Ryan Gosling refusing to eat breakfast products, and it became a viral sensation in 2013. Now, even by this point, McHenry had a BAFTA Scotland New Talent nomination to his name for a short film he'd written and directed called Zombie Musical. Now, this is a 17-minute film. You can find it still on YouTube. And Zombie Musical told the story of Anna, a teenager who's battling with all the usual high school woes, who then also found herself in the midst of a zombie outbreak. Now, the film went down well with the audience that saw it, and the ingredients for something bigger were clearly there. Tragically, there's a dark side to this story, and that's that Ryan McHenry would fall ill in 2013 at a really young age. He was diagnosed with cancer, and by that stage he'd started working on turning Zombie Musical into a feature film, and he'd recruited a pair of composers, Roddy Hart and Tommy Riley. The pair of them were new to movies, they were new to musicals, and they were part of the team that was going to turn this into a feature. Now, also recruited was co-writer Alan MacDonald, and between them all, work was underway on the script and on the songs for the film in 2013. The songs had to be worked in organically to make it work as a musical. They had to drive the story forward. That was part of the conditions of the way they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do plonked in songs just for the hell of it. It was McHenry's suggestion that the whole thing was set at Christmas. As director John McPhail would tell Rue Morgue magazine, the suggestion meant the costumes could all be bright and colourful, and the first act and the beginning of the second act could have that festive feeling, and then towards the latter part of the film, let's just say, it goes a bit darker without me spoiling the film there. Sadly, McHenry's cancer was progressing, and to the point where it was clear that the prognosis was not great, and the question was asked of him if he still wanted the film to go ahead, and he reasoned so many people had worked on it. It was a collaborative effort, and everyone ever spoken to about this film has always talked of the word collaboration, a proper collaboration, and McHenry wanted it to go ahead, and he would ultimately lose his battle with cancer in 2015, leading to some really lovely tributes, not least from Ryan Gosling, who filmed a video of himself finally eating his breakfast cereal in tribute to McHenry. What McHenry had left was detailed instructions with a close friend of his, Nason Alacaru, who was also to be the producer of the film, and McHenry had detailed just how to do the movie. Now it was down to Nason Alacaru to basically put it all together and make it happen. Now, separately to this, director John McPhail, well, he'd made a feature. He'd made a coming-of-age rom-com by the name of Where Do We Go From Here? And as the search for directors for Anna and the Apocalypse began, it was McPhail's name that was put forward by his reps. Now, McPhail's a huge fan of horror. He wanted to do something in the horror genre, but also he just clicked with the material, and he would sign on in the spring of 2016. Again, he would go to the fact that this was a collaboration from day one. When he did sign on, the film was fairly progressed at that point. 6 of the songs for the movie were already in the mix, although only three of those original 6 would ultimately be used. There was a period, I spoke to him for the first issue of our magazine actually, and he talked about that early period. They just had to keep developing the film without finance in place, so it was unpaid development work at that point. And they kept pressing, but the whole thing started to come together, and the financing was coming together as well. That by November 2016, the money was in place, the film was in full prep ahead of its shoot, and things were going forward. Now there was still some writing work being done. Going spoiler light again, there's a tonal shift in the middle of the film with a song called Human Voice. Alan MacDonald told me the story of that, about how this key song in the movie was almost accidentally included, that he talked about how Roddy Hart and Tommy Riley got a small amount of money to work from a studio, which then in turn allowed them to experiment with a more electric sound for the music they were putting together for the movie. MacDonald had originally seen that halfway tonal shift song to have a more militaristic theme, but it migrated into Human Voice as a product of the studio experimentation work. It was the song was accidentally included on a bunch of music in the end for him to listen to, and when MacDonald heard that this test that Hart and Riley had done, he said, I completely fell in love with it and rewrote the film's middle. And again, that ties to that collaborative nature of what was going on here. The collaboration would be extended further with the casting of the film, that this was going to be primarily a young ensemble. Paul Kay was brought in a key role in the movie, a deliciously key role in the movie as well. But the lead role of Anna, well, there was a lot on her shoulders, and this was a tricky one to cast. That the lead character was someone who was, university was in the offing. They were still at high school. They needed to be able to sing. They needed to be able to fight. They needed to be able to be relatable, really, someone you could really root for. The name of Ella Hunt, though, came up very early in the conversation, that her casting tape got their attention very early on, and McPhail would tell Den of Geek that she was seen pretty early in the process. What really appealed to him was that she came in even as a young actor at that point and was questioning the script, was questioning the character, and the fact that she was willing to push back and really ask intelligent questions about it all was crucial to her getting the role of Anna. The young cast came together just over those weeks, and then there was a lot of preparation that needed to be done. They were filming a musical, and also they were filming large parts of this musical on location in the cold as well. Let's not overlook that. And so as a consequence of that, the actors were brought in early. They were brought in for 2 weeks of rehearsal, primarily to work on the singing, but also they were conscious that this was a low budget film. There was not going to be space to do much experimentation on the set itself. They needed to nail these big production numbers before they got to filming. They needed to nail the actors singing as well. They weren't going to cheat that, and so they spent those 2 weeks rehearsing with the young cast, encouraging them to question their characters. In fact, day one of rehearsal, McPhail told me, was clown class. They did that as a bit of an icebreaker, that people could let their guard down, that they could basically tit about a bit and just experiment. But this also had an impact on the film, that Sarah Swire's character in the movie, and I'm going to spoil a lot as I can. I'm sorry, I know I keep saying that. But her character's walk, for instance, was developed as a consequence of that day one clown class. In fact, Sarah Swire was incredibly busy on the film, because not only did she agree to play one of the key roles in the movie, she was also the film's choreographer, which meant even when her the actor side of her job had a day off, she was still going to be on the set working with the actors and basically choreographing these big numbers. In fact, in that rehearsal period, it was the choreography really that took up the bulk of those 2 weeks. That again, it went back to the fact they weren't going to have time to faff around once they were starting filming. Now, the start of filming came in early February of 2017, and the film was being shot in Scotland in early February 2017. Exclusive, it would rain an awful lot, and also part and parcel of the shoot was they had to be on their game very, very early. That on the set, the first couple of weeks they were shooting in a school, but they had to get one of the big production numbers, Hollywood Ending, in the can on the second day of filming. So they duly shot that, and it's when they were looking back at the footage that they filmed, they kind of realised they might be onto something here, that this whole thing might be working. Another big musical number takes place outdoors in the street, and they identified a residential street in the Greenock area that would be perfect for the hosting of that sequence. And so they went about getting permission to film there in the time-honoured fashion. They went and knocked doors. They went door to door asking permission to shoot this sequence, but also they're asking a bit more of the residents, because where are we? February, March 2017. They're asking them to put their Christmas decorations back up, even though everyone was more looking towards Easter and chocolate than Christmas and crackers. Because the residents were so cooperative, and really were so cooperative, the street was decorated. They were able to get this really complex number in the can in about half a day's worth of filming, which is absolutely invaluable to the movie. McPhail told me one story as well while they were shooting on just on a street in Greenock, where a guy just turned up and said, "Oh, hello, what are you up to?" And McPhail was stood basically over a dead body. It just said, "We're filming this dead body and all this blood," and the bloke just said, "Oh, that's great." And so he was walking his girls to school, this bloke was, and so he questioned, why is this blood all over the street? It's a film that's shooting. The faces of the daughters promptly lit up, and they ran off to get their mother so she could have a look. But then for McPhail, he'd shot in and around that area before when he made his first film, and he said, "I haven't made films anywhere else. I've had that sense of community whenever I've made anything around here." And shooting in and around Scotland was hugely important to him. McPhail also opted for a little bit of the Kenneth Branagh approach, in that Kenneth Branagh always used to say in interviews, certainly when he was shooting on film, that if he had a bit more film left in the can at the end of a day's shooting, he would encourage the actors just to do something just a little more left field and just try something a bit different for the final shot of the day. And McPhail was trying to do that. He was trying to build into the schedule, and successfully did so, moments where they could just have a final go at a scene, where they could just cut loose and try stuff, and some of those moments would make it into the final movie. It was still a very demanding one. There's quite a lot of physical stuff going on just in terms of the horror effects that you see in the movie, and Ella Hunt in particular bears the brunt of that, and if you've seen the film you'll know what I mean. And McPhail would say she was genuinely my rock on this film. Even when it was down with rain, or it was freezing cold, or it was snowing, she was still out there covered in blood and still just kept going. Filming on Anna and the Apocalypse would run through to the end of March 2017, and then, I mean, the post-production was relatively quick. This was a low-budget film. It wasn't going to involve like ILM coming in to do massive visual effects work. It was all wrapped up and completed in September 2017. And then there was just like the small matter of trying to get people interested in a Christmas zombie musical comedy horror. The first stop, therefore, was in September 2017, the Fantastic Fest. And that's where the movie debuted, and it pretty much took the roof off the place. It would continue to build up word of mouth on the festival circuit. It would play at Fright Fest in the UK, for instance. By January 2018, it had secured US distribution as well when Orion Pictures signed up the movie. It would ultimately only get a limited run in cinemas, but then this was a small low-budget film, and so the idea was put out a cinema release just to raise awareness of it. But the real lifting of the film's commercial performance would be done from digital and on-demand services. In the UK, Vertigo snapped up the movie, and ultimately it was released in cinemas at the end of 2018. That the cut was put together that was 93 minutes long in the end for the theatrical release of the film. And I mean, McPhail and his team put in the boot leather to sell this one as well. I mean, I went to a Comic-Con in the West Midlands where I live, and the whole team were coming along and did a huge and really entertaining presentation on the movie. John McClane was dressed as Spider-Man, if memory serves, on that occasion, and there was a real enthusiasm in the crowd for the film, and it went to the fact that this was one of those movies that was going to need word of mouth, and still needs word of mouth in truth, to keep it going. The film was successful enough. I mean, we're certainly not talking Die Hard numbers. I mean, in the US, it would gross about $500,000, something like that. Worldwide, it wouldn't cross $1 million overall. But the reviews for it, certainly amongst genre critics, were strong. And the word of mouth continued to grow. That what was particularly impressive about it was it's a really good Christmas film. It's a really good horror movie. It's a really good musical. McPhail admitted that he didn't really approach this with genre particularly in mind. It just had to flow naturally. It just had to be driven by character, and driven by story. And I think he pretty much delivers on that, really. So much so, in fact, that the first DVD release we got of it in the UK came in April 2019. It was a fairly blank release, really, but there was enough enthusiasm for the film that the movie was then picked up by Second Sight Films for a 2-disc Blu-ray edition that would follow in December 2019. That would include an extended director's cut of the film, which added another 10 minutes that was originally cut out of the movie. There's also a soundtrack album that did pretty decent business as well. That 13 of the film's songs are all on there. There's also, if you go to the director's cut as well, where there's a deleted song or two that you'll find in the film too. But then I just kind of think whichever version of this film you're getting a real Christmas treat, really, and something a little bit left field, and something that's a real tribute to Ryan McHenry as well. I think the biggest compliment that you can pay to the team behind this film is just how they've done him proud with the movie that came from his brain, that was put into the brains of lots of other people, and the cumulative effect of this collaboration is really something really special, I think. If you've not had the chance to see Anna and the Apocalypse, I do hugely recommend that you check it out. And if you want a further dive into the movie, I can't help but recommend a back issue of a certain film magazine, the very first issue of it, that also has a lot more on the movie. Most of all, though, just the kind of film that needs your word of mouth. And if you're looking for a Christmas treat that you've likely not seen before, I would consider giving this one a go. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can find, a lot more of my wittering on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. There's lots of bits to Film Stories now. Not least our print magazines, Film Stories and Film Stories Junior, the latter for under 15s, primarily written by under 15s. The former is our monthly magazine, a new issue of which has just gone on sale. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. You can find a every weekday updated updated website with more film stories there, more movie news, more reviews at www.filmstories.co.uk. We're really proud of the fact that that's clickbait free. You can support that and this podcast at patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you to everybody who does that. It's hugely appreciated. We're on Facebook too, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find some video exclusive film stories as well on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Film Stories. Most important thing, as always, though, is that you're safe and that you take care of yourselves. I'm going to leave you in peace now. I've got the next Film Stories podcast to write, so I'll crack on with that. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. You all take care, and bye-bye.